Professor Bart Ehrman, thanks for having me on to chat with you again. I understand you're
Yeah.
doing another seminar, and this one's different than you've done before, I think
Yeah.
significantly.
Yeah.
Would
Yeah.
you spend a moment telling us about that?
Yeah. Well, I've done a lot of these things so far, but man, this one, this one is really unusual. And for me, this is one of the big ones. I'm going to be I'm going to be having a 8 lecture seminar with another scholar, a scholar of the Qur'an and Islam, and his name is Javad Hashmi, and he is he's finishing his PhD at Harvard, and we are each going to give a lecture on problems of the books that we're experts in. So we'll have 4 topics. One and I'll talk about the problems in the New Testament, and he'll talk about the same problems in the Quran. And he's not like he's not like a conservative Muslim who is afraid to engage in historical analysis. And so we're going to talk about, like, do we have the original New Testament? Do we have the original Quran? And what are the problems with that? Are there contradictions in the New Testament? Are there contradictions in the Quran? What are the problems? How do you find the historical Jesus? How do you find the historical Muhammad? Does the Bible create violence? Does the Quran create violence? These are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about. And man, I bet I'll be amazed if people have heard this stuff before from both sides. And so it's not a debate. It's not a debate at all. We're laying out there the historical data for our 2 fields.
Yeah, just before we started recording, I was talking to Derek about how in the Renaissance there was a time when Christian scholarship turned the scalpel, as he put it, onto their own scriptures, and he says, where would Christianity be if they hadn't done that? And I'm thinking if they maintained the extremist position the way we would view it now is what Christianity used to have, then I don't think it would have made it very far at all. You have to make some accommodations in order to be tolerable in an advancing society. And I would suspect that you would have to have, Muslim scholars that can't take such a hardline view as we often hear from the fundamentalists.
Yeah, well, there are very, very smart scholars of the Quran, and many of them do have traditional views of the Quran. But there are movements to recognize that it's also a human book. It's not the traditional Muslim line, obviously, but it is an interesting exercise to see in what ways is it different and which ways is it alike. It's absolutely the case that copies of the Quran, manuscripts of the Quran that we have today, they're not like the manuscripts of the New Testament, which have all these errors everywhere. The Quran manuscripts don't, but that doesn't really solve all the problems, because we still have to ask, do we know what the author wrote or what the authors wrote? And that's a trickier question when it comes to the Quran than many people expect.
Yeah, that was a problem I had with it. Just all throughout the Quran, and it constantly says how clear it is, how very clear it is. And if it's not clear to me. So when I took on the task, I went to Dubai, and a friend of mine there gave me a copy of the Quran, a translation by Abdel Halim, and he said it would be easier for a Westerner who was not raised in Islam to read this version than any other. But then other people started telling me that these political little alterations would be in this copy. So what I started doing is I compare a half a dozen different versions, Quran.com and Al Islam and so on, and I'm for verse after verse. Sometimes I'll have to have all 6 translations to understand what it's even saying. Now, yeah. Again, we're going from Arabic to English, but I've got 6 different versions of English. And I realized that if you were just to pick up one translation and just read it without any guidance, it would be much the same as if you grew up in India and say you're in Punjab, you've never met a Christian before. You know Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, but you've never met a Christian. You read the Bible, you're not going to come away with an impression of the Trinity. You're not going to think that the serpent in the garden is Satan. There's just certain things that are not written into that book. So I realized that there would be these sorts of traditional interpretations that I'm not going to know unless I have people who are raised in Islam, who speak Arabic, and can help me through this. So what I did was I did this for 3.5 years. I would read a set amount of the surahs, make notes about them in a blog post, and then I would host a video hangout where these people could then explain to me what I got right, what I got wrong, and what the interpretations were. So I didn't think about the Quran was all that clear, since I had to have so many people explain it to me. How did you do it? What is your interpretation of that?
Well, I think I think you're right. The same thing can be said about the New Testament. And I think the problem is that whenever anybody is in a particular religious tradition, there's certain things that just make common sense. And they just think that's what everybody would see if they look at it. And so when I teach my students at Chapel Hill, a lot of them have come from conservative Christian families in North Carolina and been raised in the church. And so when they'll read a passage of the New Testament and it is obvious to them what it means. But somebody who hasn't been raised in the church, I'll have a student from China, for example, who's over as a exchange student for a year, and they'll read the same thing. They'll be completely clueless. And the other interesting thing is that sometimes the common sense interpretation that somebody will have, in fact, is not what the words say, but it's what the traditional interpretation. So it just seems like that's what it says, but when you actually look at it, it sometimes says just the opposite. And so I think that I'm not surprised you had that experience, and I think it's common for anybody who tries to read scriptures from a different tradition. It's very, very difficult.
As you know, I took a course in college that was based on your collective works on the history of comparative religions. And in that course, my professor, Mark Hanshaw, who will be delighted that I dropped his name for you, he posited the hypothesis that there was a conflict or controversy in the Nicene Convention between Saint Athanasius and Saint Arius, over whether Jesus is a prophet of God or whether he's the same essence of God. And those who held that he was just a prophet, albeit with magic powers, were banished, and that some of them, he posited, ended up in the city of Medina, where Islam arose a couple centuries later. And he suggests that that's the reason why Islam has the view that Jesus was just a prophet, albeit with miraculous abilities and all of that. I mean, would that also be your position?
I don't think so. It's an interesting idea, and I have long wondered where the early Islamic traditions about Jesus and Christianity came from. There's certainly Christian influence, because there are stories in the Qur'an about Jesus that appear to have come from non-canonical gospels, for example. But in terms of their understanding of Christ, I think the problem with that is that at the Council of Nicaea, the Arians, who are as you said, they're the people who lost out. There were only a few who stuck to that view after that, although there were Arians then later. And so it may be the case that later Arians could have been an influence. But the problem is that Arians thought that Christ was the Son of God, and they actually thought he was God. But they didn't think that he's completely equal with God. And Muslims, of course, don't think he's God. He's a prophet, as you said. So I wouldn't say that it came directly from an Arian view, but I could imagine how it might have developed out of an Arian view, where like the Arians don't have the view that he's completely God, he's lesser than that, and they kind of keep going down until he's much less than that as a prophet. So it could be something like that, or I really don't know, how to trace that history very well.
Do you know, if anybody knows, where the Muslims got the idea that Jesus was never crucified or that he didn't die? Because in the Muslim tradition is that he remained alive for centuries.
Yeah, well, I'm there are people who have opinions about where it came from. I mean, I don't think that but it's a problem, because that's right, is that it's the kind of thing where, in fact, when I've talked with Muslims about it, like on my blog or whatever, somebody will say something, and for them it's common sense that Jesus didn't die, and they kind of flummox that I think he really did die. And yeah, I know, I think he really did die. And so it's one of these things, as we were saying earlier, it's like the common sense is, no, he didn't. Where did that idea come from? Well, if you're not a Christian and you don't believe he was raised from the dead, one possible explanation is that he never really died, and that's a view that's actually been floated around within Christianity, independently of Islam, for a long time. I'm not
Is
sure.
there a particular subgroup that proposed that?
No, I don't think.
Okay.
Well, it kind of depends what you mean. I mean, there were groups of Gnostics who thought that that the man Jesus died, but Christ didn't die, and that the man Jesus and the Christ were two separate beings who were temporarily unified during Jesus' ministry. But the Christ being left Jesus, the divine being left Jesus. And so Jesus died, but the Christ didn't. So you've got that. But you have one Gnostic group that we know about that says that when Jesus went to get crucified, this fellow Simon of Cyrene carried his cross for him. And when they got to the place of crucifixion, Jesus pulled an identity switch. It was a miracle. He took on the appearance of Simon of Cyrene, and he made Simon of Cyrene look like him. And so they crucified the wrong guy. and according to this version, Jesus stood by the cross laughing because they got the wrong person. And so you have that kind of thing. And so, it could have developed out of something like that, maybe. Or maybe it's
Jesus the facetious.
Yeah, exactly. The facetious Jesus. Yeah. I don't think Simon.
One of the confusing things about the Qur'an for me, reading it, was that, with the single exception of, I think it was Joshua, the Qur'an doesn't really go into the stories from the Bible. I mean, it references Noah and Moses and Adam and so on almost constantly, but it never goes into more than a Reader's Digest summary of these of the biblical fables. The only stories that the Qur'an does get into outside of the life of Muhammad are tales from their ancestral folklore. Yet the way the Qur'an is written is always with the assumption that the reader is already familiar with the old Bible stories and don't need to hear them again. And the problem with that seems to be that there are significant differences in the Muslim tradition. I mean, for example, the birth of Jesus is entirely different. And then Solomon is heavily embellished with magical powers, like control of the wind, and he has genies under his control, and he has the Dr. Doolittle's ability to talk to animals and that sort of thing. And I don't remember any mention of the serpent in the garden or of eating forbidden fruit, to the best of my memory. And there are practically no specifics regarding Noah's Ark. So did 7th century Arabs know all these stories, and were they all different than what we read in the Bible?
They wouldn't have been different because these were the biblical stories, except insofar as they may have had Jewish expositions of some of these stories. So that in Jewish traditions as well, it's not simply, today, I'd say evangelical Christians today, when they read a story about Noah or something about Solomon, they read it and that's literally what happened and that's what you know. But in the Jewish tradition, really, the Bible really wasn't functioning as this word for word revelation of the only thing you can know from God. It was more kind of in many Jewish circles, learned circles, it was a place for exposition of the accounts where you develop the traditions. And so there's entire Jewish lore about biblical figures and others that are more expansive. And so I don't know whether the authors of the Quran are what they're familiar with. I think they probably do know the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish scriptures, but I don't know, how much they're interpreting it through other Jewish lenses.
They do seem to be coming from different sources. So if I got time for one more question, it's
Yeah.
My understanding of the Hebrew scriptures is that rabbis can add whatever commentary they want and into what the Talmud, for example, and that's considered authoritative. And my understanding of the Hadiths is similar, that Muslim scholars can add whatever comments they want, and believers are to regard them as authoritative too. Even though the people my panel of Arabic-speaking people who were raised in Islam said that they don't even know how many Hadiths there are. And so what is your understanding or interpretation of the Hadiths? And because it all seems to be like human clarifications on God's unalterable and incorruptible word. It's like people coming in and say, well, what God meant to say is.
Yeah, well, even more than that, because it's not just interpretation, it's elaboration and exposition. And I would say this is what happens in all major religious traditions that I know of, including Christianity, is that, today, again, we're kind of accustomed to thinking about conservative evangelicals who stick to the biblical text and they just want the biblical text. But, in early Christianity is a very similar thing where you have an account of Jesus' birth, which you mentioned a second ago. Well, you have all these later accounts of Jesus' birth that are expositions filling it out. And what happens before Jesus' birth and the life of his mother Mary to lead up to that, what happens at the birth that we aren't told in the Bible, what happens immediately after the birth that we aren't told in the Bible, what happens when they go down to Egypt that's not told. So you get that in the Christian tradition. You definitely get it in the Jewish tradition as well, where you have these full elaborations of biblical accounts, and then you get it in the Islamic tradition. And so in all three of these major monotheistic traditions, you get that. And I think the irony for people who were raised in sort of biblically oriented forms of Christianity is that just seems weird, because why would you possibly want to tell a story that isn't in the Bible about the biblical figures? Because the Bible's our source. But it's a really kind of a modern thing. Throughout antiquity, in all of these religions, it wasn't like that. This is a modern phenomenon. So the idea of expounding on these on traditions about Muhammad or about Moses or Elijah or Jesus or whatever, the idea of expounding on these may seem weird to people today, but not doing it would have seemed weird to most people throughout history.
All right. Well, I think that's all I have time for. I want to thank you very much for your time. Best of luck on your seminar.
Okay, thanks.